So hello and welcome to another teaching of in the series Unorthodox Moves of God. I am Zakiya Monique, Master Relationship Strategist, Transformational Speaker, Bestselling author of Killer Connections. And we are in this series of learning how much we you know, don't realize that God sometimes makes unorthodox moves and he makes these moves for different reasons. Sometimes in order to outsmart the enemy, you can't move the way that you've always moved. You have to do something different. If you don't believe me, think about when God is calling your plays. Okay, recently there was a situation that I um was going through, and God instructed me to do something totally different than what I would have normally done and what was expected. And this is how you catch the enemy off guard to the point where, because the enemy doesn't know everything. He doesn't know everything. We tend to think that the enemy knows everything. He does not know everything. And so when we respond, I remember when I was growing up, they would say, praise confuses the enemy, things like that. Well, the enemy, and God uses confusion. He may not be the author of confusion, but he uses confusion oftentimes to defeat the enemy. So how do you think he uses confusion? He does something that's very unorthodox, like telling somebody to walk around a city 7 times, telling you to do unorthodox things to get the result that you ultimately want, right? But we have to know the voice of the Lord, because when he's initially instructing us to do this thing, like he told Noah, it doesn't seem like it's God, because like this makes no sense, or this seems to go against your word, or maybe this is not the culture that you normally would, or the community or the way that you would normally do a thing. Uh-oh, she's talking. The phone started talking. Anyway, so this is not the way that that God would normally want us to do a thing. And he may not tell us to go against his word per se. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that God is going to tell you to do something against his word, but it'll be against his quote unquote nature. Okay. We haven't gotten to the part in the teaching yet where we talked about Elijah going to live with the widow, but understand that living with a woman, he's single, she's single, that wasn't the nature of God per se, right? They weren't married, so that's not what we know God to endorse. However, we'll find out why. Okay, we'll find out why and what happened, et cetera, et cetera. So ultimately, there are some times when God will he will have us to do some things that are unorthodox, and people may ridicule us. They may not understand it. They may not, and we have to be willing to go through that aspect of things in order for us to see what the end is going to be. But we got to know it's God. We got to know it's God. Okay. And that's the thing. So we're talking about the unorthodox moves of God. I want to do a very, 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 very quick overview. We are in Exodus now, but these are some scriptures that the main scriptures for the entire series is at the top: Mark 7, John 10, and John 10, 4 and 5, and John 10, 27. Those are for excuse me if you hear I don't know if you guys can hear the lawn care service cutting the grass, but anyway. And then we're in Exodus right now, looking at the children of Israel. Again, the problem, we put God in a box and question him or his moves when it doesn't look like him, or when he doesn't do what we think we should, he should do. But we got to understand, we may know the character of God, and we know that God is the same yesterday and today and forever, but his thoughts are not our thoughts and his ways are not our ways. And so that always leaves a little bit of an element that we don't have access to. Okay. So the how and the why are not always revealed right away. But the assurance that we have is that when God makes a move that may cause question, he always brings revelation for why it needed to happen at the end. So when the dust settles and when the smoke clears, people will know that it was God. So, they ridiculed Noah, but when the dust settled and when the smoke cleared, they knew there was a flood that came. You know, um, this brings vindication to those who were obedient but were ridiculed. Okay, and this is why we should obey, no matter how ridiculous the assignment seems. But we have to know that it's the voice of the Lord. We have to know that it's the voice of the Lord, even when the move does not seem like him. Okay. So those are the assurances. The assurance that we have is that no matter how much mocking, how much ridicule, no matter how much we go through, this is why God says, I'll give you double for your shame. Because we will go through the shame of looking crazy, looking, whatever, however we look, for believing God. But on the other end of it, people will come to know that it was him. Okay, and that's the assurance that we have. So unorthodox, I want to talk about what that means so that we all have the same understanding, is that not conforming to rules, traditions, modes of conduct, a doctrine, a religion, or a philosophy. It's not orthodox. It's deviating from commonly accepted beliefs or practices. It is unconventional. It is non-traditional. It's non-conforming. It's iconoclastic. It defies what you know. So what you've come to know about God, it may defy that. It may defy that. But again, go back to the assurance. As long as you know it was his voice and it is his leading, you have an assurance that on the other end of the thing, when the dust settles, when the smoke clears, they will know that it was God. Okay? And so that's the assurance that we have. So we talked about Noah and the flood. You can go back and watch that. Then we talked about the journey of Abram. You can go back and watch that series, that part of the series. And then we talked about the life of Joseph. You can go back and watch that. Now we're talking about the wilderness experience of Moses and the children of Israel, and we're talking about the Exodus as well. So we're talking about kind of like all of that, okay? And last week we talked about the plagues, but I want to just give a little bit of a preface that, with the children of Israel, God allowed them to continue to flourish. That was unorthodox. So it was very unorthodox because even though they were being worked, and they were being worked with sometimes minimal supplies, God allowed them to continue to flourish and multiply despite the efforts of Pharaoh to afflict and reduce them in number. God also dealt well with midwives and gave them families, even though they lied. God did not reward the lying, he rewarded the loyalty. See, people often say, but the midwives lied, but they were loyal to God. So the reason why they lied was because they were protecting the Hebrew firstborn. And so Pharaoh's because Pharaoh had given the mandate to kill all of the firstborns, the reason why the midwives lied was to save Moses ultimately. Okay, to save Moses. And so God did not reward their lying, but it was unorthodox. He didn't reward the lying, but he rewarded their loyalty to him and his plan. See, again, there are some times where in the midst of us doing the thing of God, maybe we might make a mistake. He won't reward the mistake, but because he knew their hearts, this is why we have to be careful with judging, because God knew and knows the heart of a person. And so you may see something and say, well, they got away with this, but he knew their heart. Their hearts never turned from him. So even though they lied, and God does not reward or like lying at all, but their hearts were never turned from him, and they were lying to do his will. Okay. And so he rewarded their loyalty, not the lying, but the loyalty. And that was unorthodox of God because it looked like they were able to get away with lying. Okay. God allowed baby Moses to be placed along the bank of the Nile River in a basket. Okay, in a basket. And the Nile River could have easily just swallowed him up. Even being on this animal, anything could have happened. But he caught the attention of Pharaoh's daughter. Okay. God allowed the children of Israel to be oppressed to the point where they would cry out for his intervention. God does not like to afflict pain. He does not like for us to have to be broken all the way down before we call upon him. However, if that's the way that he can get our attention, Jonah, then he'll send you to that cold, wet, dark place. Okay, so we have to be very careful with ignoring God and trying to take his grace for granted. God appeared in a burning bush that was not consumed. And due to his presence, he made the place where Moses was holy. He revealed his plan to Moses. That's over in Exodus 3. Since when does a bush burn, but then it doesn't burn up? Right? Very unorthodox. God turned the staff into a serpent and back into a staff to prove to Moses that he had the power to go before him. That's over in Exodus 4. He turned Moses' hand leprous and then back to normal after putting it inside of a cloak. Why? To show him that he had power. Again, in Exodus 4. Okay. God hardened Pharaoh's heart to demonstrate his power to the children of Israel for the road ahead. Okay. God knew that Pharaoh was never ever going to change. He knew. See, here's the thing, and this is why we have to be careful giving up on people. We have to be careful judging people. We have to be careful throwing people away because God knows who's going to change. He knows it. And I believe in my heart that when God gives us a commission to pray for someone, okay, when he gives us a commission to pray for someone and to stand for that person and to labor for that person, even if they don't change in the amount of time that we think they should, or we don't see any inklings of change, I'm telling you, there's no way God is going to have us continue to pray and labor in prayer for a person that's never going to change. I've experienced this personally. Okay, personally. I asked God, why didn't you have me stand for this person? He said, I knew they were never going to change. And that person was killed in their sin. And they never changed. You know, another person, I said, why didn't you have me stand for this person? Because I didn't understand why he called me to. There were two people he had me to stand for. I had never known that's what it was called. I had heard of intercession before. You know, I heard of interceding. Interceding is typically when, you know, God will have you pray for a person. But standing for that person is a little bit different because now you're interceding and fasting and you're laboring in prayer for this person over a longer period of time, you know, as opposed to just interceding for someone. And so when God initially had me to stand for someone, it was my mother. So I can understand him having me stand for my mother, you know, and he had me to stand for my mother and pray and pray and pray. And one day we went to a prayer meeting and a man said, and the man didn't know how we were kin. He didn't know if we were kin. And he said to my mother from the pulpit, everybody was standing, you know, we weren't standing up like us two or nothing. Nope. He said, you're going to be saved because of her prayers. Okay. And at the time, my mother was still in addiction. My mother was in addiction for 29 years. And one day, God had an encounter with her. She never had to go to a NA meeting. She never had to go to rehab. He encountered her in such a way, and it was so powerful that she never used drugs anymore to date. She did not use drugs again to date. And so ultimately, he had me stand because he knew she would change. Did she change in the amount of time that I think she should have? No. Did I get tired of standing? Yes. You know what I'm saying? Did I sometimes not see a change? No. You know why I didn't see a change? Because it happened in a sudden moment. It happened in a sudden moment. God visited her one day and a change happened in one day. See, sometimes we don't see a person, we're looking for a gradual change, and sometimes God says it may not happen that way. He can encounter that person and that person will be forever changed for the rest of their lives. That's his business. That's between him and them. We just need to follow what he's telling us to do on their behalf. But I'm a firm believer that if God tells us to labor in prayer for a person and fast, he's not telling us to do all of this for no reason. It's because that person is going to change. We just have to be mindful and prayerful and do what he tells us to do. Okay? So, God hardened Pharaoh's heart to demonstrate his power to the children of Israel for the road ahead. And we find that in Exodus 5 and Exodus 7 as well. But again, like I said, he knew that Pharaoh's heart was never really truly going to change. He knew it. He's God, of course, but he knew it. Okay. So he used that. Remember, I told you God may not create the confusion, you know, but he'll certainly use it. And he knew if his heart's not ever going to change, then I may as well use him to get some glory out of it. Okay. So God is going to get the glory. Okay. So then we went into the plagues. Okay. So we went into the plagues, and the first plague was turning water into blood. And that's over in Exodus 7 and 14. And we talked about how fish died, it smelled, it affected the drinking and bathing, and that's not of God's nature. It's not of God's nature to kill, to kill fish, to kill, and for it to smell and to affect their drinking and bathing and things of that nature. That was not of his nature. Um, Frogs. Exodus 8. Frogs were everywhere, including the bedrooms and the beds of Pharaoh. And the frogs died everywhere too. But the significance of frogs is that in that time, frogs were seen as good luck charms to increase the fertility of the Egyptian people. And God is like, I don't think so. I am God. Okay? You will not have no other gods. And so frogs were sacred and were not to be killed because of the Egyptian goddess of fertility and resurrection, who was said to have the god she was said to have the head of a frog and the body of a woman. So God killing those frogs also was symbolic in him tearing down idolatry. Okay, that was his judgment of idolatry. Then there was gnats. And gnats were created from God's instruction to strike dust with a rod to create gnats. And that was his judgment against the Egyptian god of the desert. And this was also the first plague that the magicians could not duplicate. And so this showed his dominance. All right. And so this was also a judgment on idolatry, and it showed God's sovereignty even over the dust of the earth, because in that time, the Egyptians were used to having gods over specific areas. There was not one God over every area. And so they had the God over the weather. They had the God over the desert. They had the God over the water. They had the God over this, the God over that. And if you think about it, in some of those territories, they still have that. They still have the marine goddess and gods, and they still have gods over certain areas, not one God over everything. And so God was asserting his nature and saying, I'm the God over everything. And I'll make it where the magicians cannot duplicate. I will make you understand that I can work with dust the same way I work with water. Because up until then he had dealt with everything with water, and so it would be easy to say, "Oh, well, he's just the God of water." No, he's like, let me go over here to this dust. I can do that too. And so he was asserting his sovereignty. Then we move to flies. Flies were sent to Pharaoh's palace and all over Egypt. And the symbolism of flies was that was a symbol of persistence, and were believed in Egyptian mythology to protect against misfortune and disease. And God was like, yeah, so watch this, right? And so then diseased livestock. That was an unorthodox move, because not one livestock of the Israelites died, but the livestock were vital for sustenance and bartering and business and transportation. So it's not like God to take away or to tear down or to destroy technically. When we think of his nature, we think of God that builds up and that gives and loves and all of that. But we have to understand that he can be the God of war as well. But understand that the only time that God steps into that nature is when we are repetitively disobedient. After God says, stop, no, cut it, quit, we continue, then that's when God usually brings out the destruction. When we have continued to turn our backs and hearts to him to do what we want. He doesn't usually bring destruction when you make a mistake the first time or one time. It's usually when you are in a pattern of disrespecting his grace. It's when you're in a pattern of turning from him. It's when you're in a pattern of saying, I'm gonna do what I want to do. Okay. But God is always waiting and ready to forgive. He's always waiting and willing and ready to restore. Okay. And so then we moved, that was diseased livestock in Exodus 9. Then we moved over to boils. They took soot from a furnace, threw it in the air, and it became a film of dust all over Egypt that caused sores and boils on people and animals. And this showed God's power to afflict and heal, because he healed all of that once Pharaoh said he was going to let the people go. So he was able to afflict just like he was able to heal. And it also showed power over the Egyptian gods that were believed to have power over disease and healing. Okay, I think that was like Isis, Sekhmet, and Sunu, Sunu. Okay, so that was that. So now we're starting at hell. That's our review. We're starting at hell. And Exodus 9 and 24 says so there was hail and fire mingled with the hail, very grievous, such as there was none like it in all the land of Egypt since it became a nation. Since when can hail, which is nothing but hardened water, be mingled with fire and not melt? I don't know if we want to call this unorthodox, but it certainly is miraculous, okay? Because hail is nothing but ice, it's hardened water. So, since when can hardened water be mingled with fire and not melt? And there was no hail in Goshen. So it hailed everywhere around Goshen, but not Goshen. And does that mean that there was no sin in Goshen, like nobody sinned or nobody made a mistake in Goshen? No. No, it doesn't. It just means they were a people. He was keeping his promise to the forefathers. They were a blessed people as a whole. Because the children of Israel cut up all the time. But they were a blessed people because of who they came from. This is why we have to be careful what we pass down to our children. Because just like we can pass blessings, we can pass curses too. That's where generational curses come from. They were a blessed people. So it didn't mean that they didn't make mistakes or didn't have, didn't do anything in Goshen. They were a blessed people. They were chosen. And when you're chosen, you're a blessed people. And you're covered and sheltered. Oftentimes. Okay. So hail. That was Exodus 9:24. Then we move to locusts. Locusts, that's Exodus 10. And the significance there was that the locusts ate the remaining crops. So look, it's been through all this other stuff. You can have frogs and flies and gnats and water that's turned into blood and it's smelling bad and all this going on. And these polar crops, struggling already. But then you send the locusts to come eat the rest of them, right? Locusts ate the remaining crops, which then affected economics, and it could also set the stage for what? A famine. Remember, crops meant everything. Crops meant everything. Okay, and so here they are, and then it also was bringing down that crop god. Because if you remember back in our teachings, when we talked about Jezebel, the hail of Jezebel, remember that they were sacrificing children and they were sacrificing things so that they could have a good crop year. So they were going to sacrifice and to the gods that were over the crops, to have a good crop year. Like even if giving up their children to have a good crop year. So God is like, yeah, so let me destroy these crops so that y'all can see that ain't no crop God can protect these crops. I'm here. I'll destroy it all. Okay, so again, he's bringing down idolatry as well. Okay, but the locusts came and ate the remaining crops, which definitely impacted the Egyptians, the economics, and also set the stage for possible famine. Then we move to Exodus 10:21, where there was a darkness over the land for 3 days. 3 days of darkness. And why is this unorthodox of God? Because God is associated with light. God is not known for darkness. Psalm 18:28. Psalm 18:28 says, God turns my darkness into light. Psalm 119:105. 119:105 says, the word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. John 8:12. I know it's New Testament, but John 8:12 says, Jesus says, I'm the light of the world. So everything associated with God, whether it's God in the spirit, God in the flesh, which is Jesus, the Holy Spirit, the Word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So everything associated with God is associated with what? Light. So it was unorthodox for God to bring what? Darkness. Because darkness was associated with the enemy. It was associated with the enemy. So it could have been that if they didn't know it was God bringing this darkness, they could have thought that the enemy was bringing the darkness. But this was God bringing darkness. Okay? And then last but definitely not least, the Egyptian firstborns. Now, I won't go through the whole, blood over the doorpost, like any of that. But God is known, he's not known for taking life typically. God is not known for taking life, but for giving life and giving life more abundantly. That's over in John 10 and 10. And this damaged the structure of the Egyptians because they rely heavily on a patriarchal lineage and a heritage that was passed down through the firstborn sons, right? But this was a perfect example of reaping what you sow. Why? Because wasn't that Pharaoh that had asked for the firstborn of the Hebrews? And so God was like, so now we're gonna take your firstborn. We're gonna take yours. Okay. And so those were the plagues, all right, and that was very unorthodox. Some moves of God that showed that, wow, like, uh-oh, we didn't see God in that way. We didn't know that God would be that way. But again, when the smoke cleared and the dust settled, what happened? The Exodus. So all these plagues led to what? The Exodus. It led to them actually being freed. Now, if they would have never been freed after all of these plagues, now we got to wonder. But when the smoke cleared and the dust settled, they were eventually freed. So when we sit back and we look at some things and we say that it was God, ask yourself, if it was God, when the smoke cleared and the dust settled, what happened? Because if it's God, like with my mother, when God told me to labor for my mother and pray for my mother, when the smoke cleared and the dust settled, my mother got off drugs. So if we don't see any evidence, then we can't be assured that it was God. The assurance that we have is that there will be some level of evidence. There will be some level of evidence when the smoke clears and the dust settles. Okay. And that's how we know. Now we already knew it was his voice, but the confirmation that we get, because remember, God always confirms. The confirmation is when the smoke clears and the dust settles and we see the act of why God had us praying, why God needed Noah to build the ark, why Joseph had to go before them, why this had to happen, why that had to happen. Okay. Now I want to talk about a few other things, and I'm going to ask if you had any other revelations after they were released, because we know when they were released, the Egyptians gave them all of their stuff. God told them that they were going to leave with spoils. They would, in other words, they were going to leave with riches. And so the Egyptians were like, take it here, take it, take it. They gave them stuff like, go, please, just go. Right. So they left with spoils. That's another way that we know that when we're in a battle for the Lord, when we're in a battle for the Lord, when we're doing something for the Lord, we never leave empty-handed. We always leave with some spoils. We always leave with something in our hand. We always leave with something. That's another assurance that we have, is that when we're doing something for the Lord, we always leave with something better, greater. We never leave empty-handed. Okay. When God told David to go and pursue, David didn't just come back with the stuff that they had took. He came back with all of it. He came back with their stuff too. So when God is telling us to go and pursue it and go and fight and all of that, and he's fighting with us and he's fighting for us and he's going before us, we never come back empty-handed. We never even come back breaking even. We always come back and come out of it with more, better, greater than we had before. Okay. In a good way. Okay. So, were there any other things that you found yeah, leaving with the spoils? Yeah. Yeah, very very unorthodox, because the Egyptians wasn't giving them jack. Okay. Anything else that you found, because remember, this is interactive. So were there any other things that you found upon their immediate release that was unorthodox, unconventional? Remember, unconventional, just not normal, not a normal happening. Anything that you found?
You touched on it because I was going to say the leaving with the spoils because like you said, I wrote that down. That's the main thing that stood out to me.
Okay.
And with the treasures, they had plenty, and yeah. just that was the main thing I wrote down.
Okay, so I want to bring your attention to something. I'm gonna share this and then we'll close up for the day. But I want to bring your attention to Exodus 13 and 17. So I'm gonna read that. Give me 1 second to pull it up on my phone. So Exodus 13 and 17. It says, now when Pharaoh had let the people go, see, that's your assurance. He actually eventually let him go one day. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like all of this would like mean nothing if he just never let him go. So now when Pharaoh had let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, even though it was near. For God said the people might change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. Right? Hence, God led the people around by the way of the wilderness to the Red Sea, and the sons of Israel went up in martial array from the land of Egypt. Now, let's move over to, Exodus 14. Now, when we get to Exodus 14, it tells us that God hardened Pharaoh's heart again and made him chase after them. Okay, that's verse 4. He made them chase after them, and they were at the Red Sea. And here's what I want to bring your attention to. It says, verse 11 says, then they said to Moses, is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? So very unorthodox. I don't even know if we want to call it unorthodox, but God would not lead them through the land of the Philistines because there was a war, right? And there was a war, so he said, "Nah, I can't take them that way because then they'll surely want to return to Egypt." But what happened when they got to the Red Sea? They wanted to return to Egypt. They said, "Did you bring us out here because there wasn't enough graves? Is this why you brought us here?" So it was like, wow. Why would he take them around the Philistine to the Red Sea? And they were gonna think that way anyway. You know why? Because he wanted to do what? Part the sea for them. He couldn't part the sea in the war, but parting the sea gave him the opportunity to, number one, shut down Pharaoh because he was done with that. He was done with Pharaoh, and that was his last act. He was done with Pharaoh. So taking them by the way of the Red Sea allowed him to do that one final act. That one final act of parting the sea for them and then allowing the sea to come back into place to drown their enemies. And notice what he said in the Bible, what was said in the Bible, the enemies you see today, you'll see no more. Exodus 13 says, but Moses said to the people, do not fear. Stand by and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you have seen today, you will never see them again forever. The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent. While you keep silent. He parted the sea. He couldn't get that glory in the war. But he parted the sea. It needed to be something miraculous. Why? He had already done 10 plagues. And they still was talking about going back to Egypt. So he had done 10 plagues, including killing firstborns, gnats, flies, boils, hail. He had done all of this stuff. And they still was like, did you just bring us out here to kill us? So he's like, I'll part this sea for you. And then you'll know that I'm God. He parted the sea, they walked through, and then when their enemies tried to come and go through that same parting, he said, put the sea back together and drowned them. The enemies they saw that day, they never saw again. But it was also the end of Pharaoh because he knew his heart was going to continue to be hard. So he was like, I got the glory out of his life. Very, very unorthodox of God to perform a miracle in front of their eyes. He couldn't have done that at the war. He could have done that at the war. And see, at the war, they were very close in proximity to walk back to Egypt. But ultimately, if I bring them by the way of the wilderness and I part this Red Sea, they will know that I'm God. Very unorthodox. Because they in both places they was still gonna have the same response, but his response was gonna be different. Okay, his response was gonna be different. All right. So we will move on from the children of Israel because I think we've made our point there. It was so many um unorthodox acts, so many things. But we had a full teaching on this. So feel free to go back if you're watching this at a later time to go back and look at our teaching on the children of Israel, the wilderness experience that they had. And you can go, delve into that there. But we're going to move on in our series, Lord's Will, and we'll talk about some other unorthodox moves of God, Lord's will, in the next session. So I'm going to stop the recording here.